This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. All right, welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today we're going to talk about flying among the storms at KHBC. Now, KHBC is Kokrine Hills Bible Camp. It is a Bible camp located in a very remote place in Alaska. If you were to take, look at a map of Alaska and you try to stick your finger as close to the middle of the state as you could, you'd probably have your finger at where the Kokrine Hills Bible Camp is. If you go to the kokrinehills.org, you can get more information there, but Kokrine Hills Bible Camp's been around since 1964, and it was started by some missionaries at the time wanting to do something unique for the youth in Alaska. And they were cruising down their boat down the Yukon, and they found this tract of land with a really fresh water, creek running through it, and they built a little cabin there. And they started hauling kids in by boat from the nearby villages, which are Tanana and Ruby. So if you look on a map, the camp itself is halfway between the village of Tanana and the village of Ruby on the north side of the camp. Well, since 1964, the camp has grown quite a bit. They have much more facilities, and when Samaritan's Purse got involved and they helped fund bigger buildings and better facilities. They now have like a full kitchen. It's like stainless steel refrigerators, freezers, big, huge stoves, and they have a higher capacity to feed a lot of people, which is neat because they started from just one little log cabin and, people trying to prepare meals for a lot of kids in a little cabin. But now it's like pretty sophisticated, and, thanks to Samaritan's Purse to make it something sustainable and make it a, very, I was going to use the word comfortable. Maybe that's too strong a word. Just a good experience for campers, for all the basic things that a camp needs, and now it has that. So that's Kokrine Hills Bible Camp. And I think this summer was my fourth summer flying for the camp. I fly, if you've been listening to the show, you probably know I fly a Cherokee 6. It's a PA-32, 300 horsepower, and I use that to fly for the camp. And this year was my fourth year doing it, and I'm hoping for many more. It was a very good year, and I thought I would use this episode to share some of tell some of the flying stories that happened this year. So here's the data of my flight time and such. I flew 96 hours in the last month for the camp. I flew 184 people, did 81 landings, and I flew 10,401 miles. Now, you can excuse my slightly bit of nerdiness, but I like to make comparisons, like to make a description or draw a picture, so to speak. So 10,401 miles is like flying across the continental United States 4 times. Or on one of my busier flying days, I would have flown a distance equivalent to the southern tip of Florida direct to New York City in a single day. That same distance is kind of like flying across the state of Texas twice. Texans, they're prideful about how big Texas is, but Alaska's 2.5 times bigger than Texas. So, it's kind of like, yeah, you're not that big. The area we covered, including all the villages we went to, was about the size of the state of Nebraska. I flew to 8 different villages: Nenana, Huslia, Galena, Kobuk, Shungnak, Selawik, Buckland, and Koyuk. Those are the ones I went to. If you include the other pilots, there was 4 pilots and planes. They went to a few other villages as well. So there were 4 planes total, 2 Cherokee 6s and 2 206s. And of course, I fly the PA-32-300. Now, my one role is just the flying part. And I do other things at the camp. I shared a handful of devotions. I helped out with the various activities. I got destroyed in Camp for Staff basketball. And I had my family there. And it was really important to me to have my family there. As a family, we do as much as possible together. And it was just so sweet to have my two young kids and my wife there with me. And, when we call them flying days, where I would pretty much be gone all day long, flying people in or out or supplies in and out. But then on non-flying days, I got to just be with my family at the camp. And it's really become one of the sweetest times of the year for our family is at camp. And I'll talk about some of that. I do want to lean into more of the flying stuff just for entertainment value. Some of the and also it's because it was my role was the flying part. But I want to acknowledge too that the core and the best things that happened were with the volunteer staff that came in. We would bring in these volunteer teams from various churches, some from Alaska, a bunch from California. There's one from Florida. I think there might have been one from Ohio or something. I don't remember. Anyway, there's also teams that come from Pennsylvania. Like there's these Amish groups that come and they do projects before the camp, and then after the camps are all done, they come again and they do more projects, and they're just like workhorses. They know how to build things and get things done. They're just awesome folks. I just want to acknowledge while I do the flying, that is just a little kind of microcosm of what it takes to make the camp happen. All the work teams that come to fix things, to prepare the camp, the work teams after, and then during camp, there's all the camp counselors, the activity coordinators, there's the camp directors, and then of course there's the pilots. And so I just have my little niche at the camp, and I'll lean into some of the flying parts because my experience at camp is quite different than everyone else's because they're on the ground running activities, and I might be in Timbuktu somewhere flying. And so we have totally different experiences. So I could tell some flying stories. There's 4 pilots in all that were there. There's 3 of us that go every year. Myself with a Cherokee, another pilot with a Cherokee named Jeff. There's another pilot named Adam who was in the last episode, Adam White. So make sure you check out that episode to hear his story. Adam has the most experience of all of us, especially here in Alaska. He's been here like 30 years, and I've been here like 5. So we definitely defer to Adam a lot for his expertise. And he flies a Pitilly 206, and we have awesome Cherokees. I joke, his plane is actually very, very capable and better in a lot of ways. But some of the things that happened this year, there was no incidents. And talking to some of the directors, they were saying they've, in the 60 years of history in this camp, and this is the camp's 60th year anniversary, they've never had an aviation incident. And so they have a well-deserved record of safety. And so when, we pick up kids in the villages, it always baffles me. I'm like, you're letting me fly away with your child. It's almost like a weird feeling that I have. I'm like, really? Are you sure? But what it comes from is a testimony of many, many years of safety. They've never had an aviation incident in 60 years. And so that's just great. And so, of course, we as pilots, we work very hard to be as safe as possible. And so the machines we're flying, we make sure they're very well inspected and well cared for. We do preparations before the camp. We get ourselves IFR current. We do quite a few flights just to make sure we're tuned up really well for landing in these more difficult places. And so the handful of flights that we do just to make sure that we're still competent and we're still safe. And a lot of maintenance time goes into the planes as well. So all of that is a testimony of 60 years of safety at this camp. And we really want to keep that going. So, and it's been great. So that's kind of the 3 of us are pilots who've been flying together for some years now. for the camp. And we added a fourth pilot, which is his name is Derry. He's he comes from he's an instructor at a school called MATA, which is like I should have looked this up before I hit record. Missionary Aviation Training Academy. I believe that's right. It's based out of Washington State, and I don't know if they do it every year. I guess most years they send up a plane or two up to Alaska, and they do various flying. What they're trying to do is give aviation exposure to their flight students. And so when Derry came, he's a very experienced pilot. He's a good pilot, and he brought a student with him. And I think there was 4 students in all. And so every week or so, he would fly to Fairbanks and pick up a different student and give them exposure. And so we added Derry, but Derry wasn't there the entire time. He was there a little over half the time, I think. And the rest of the time, it was just the 3 of us pilots. So it was really nice having a 4th plane because it was a very heavy season for flying. Like before Derry got there, the 3 of us pilots carried quite a heavy load. Like the first week of camp is high school camp. High school camp's always a challenge because they're high schoolers. They're not junior hires or elementaries. They're heavier. And when they're heavier, we're more careful about weight and balance. So we tend to go a little lighter on the fuel. We're almost always taken off at gross weight. And we're always like swapping bags around, or that bag's got us to come on a later flight because I'm at max gross weight. It's just more challenging because the campers themselves are heavier. And so we're always doing weight and balance calculations. We're always making sure we have enough fuel with reserve. I'm a fuel hog. I like to take as much fuel as possible. And so if I'm a little bit lighter, I will add fuel just because flying over very remote places and having the FAA's requirement of 30 minutes of reserve is just not enough because it can be over an hour before you can find a place to land. And so we make our minimum at least an hour, and we usually have more than that in reserve. And even if you've ever flown a Cherokee 6, there are 4 fuel tanks. And when the way my engine monitor is, when the tank gets under 5 gallons, it just flashes red at you. There's nothing I can do to change that setting. It will flash red at me. And so if you have 4 tanks with 5 gallons each, that's 20 gallons. So that's like an hour and 15 minutes or so of fuel, or maybe a little more than that, which is enough. But you'll have red flashing lights at you the whole time. And getting your fuel tanks down low, you never want to run out of fuel tank dry. And so it's a little uncomfortable when your fuel tanks are getting low and they're flashing red. So anyway, point is, we're fuel hogs. We like to bring a lot of fuel. But when the campers or the staff we're flying in are heavy, we have to limit how much baggage they can bring. And so we set a 30-pound limit per person. Most of the time it's fine, but some people really, it's only 33 pounds. It's okay. And I'm like, is it though? Come on. But most of the time, we always work it out. And sometimes it's an extra flight for just baggage, but we always make it work because our priority is safety and not saving money. But anyway, I digress. So one of the flying stories is, for example, like a theme this year was storms. Like I think I titled the episode Flying Among the Storms. The reason was there was just so much stormy weather this summer. And it seems like the summers come in themes. Like one year it was fires, another year it was flooding, and I forget what I think another year I flew, it was like great weather the whole time. But this year it was storms. And so almost all of our flights were, dodging storms, we like to say, or sort of like skiers have a slalom where they're like going back and forth. We had to do that, but like going around rainstorms. And when I say storms, I don't always mean it's like thunder, lightning, and craziness. Usually it was like rain cells. So you can see a cluster of rain over there, a cluster of rain over there, and you want to fly in between them. Sometimes I would intentionally fly through the edge of a rainstorm just to get the airplane washed because we get kind of dusty down there on the runway. Um, but it's kind of like going through a car wash. It's kind of fun, actually. So it was a lot of that. And I remember one particular time I was flying up to Kobuk to pick up campers. Now, when we take off from camp, the camp is nestled up against the Kokrine Hills. That's why it's called Kokrine Hills Bible Camp. And we have to turn down river to get to most of the villages. So we take off from camp, hang a right, and we're flying down the Yukon until we get to a pass through the Kokrine Hills. There's this pass that we fly through. When you get through the pass, then that gives us access to a lot of the villages we go to, including Kobuk. So I get through the pass, just sort of a standard procedure like we always do, and there's a massive storm there. The reason I didn't know that there was a massive storm there is because there is no radar coverage where we are. We're like in a black hole of radar coverage. And it is possible to get some satellite images, but it's hard to tell where the actual conditions are that we can't fly through because there's no radar. And so the best thing we can do is just look at the weather cameras to the villages in the areas we're going to be flying, check weather reports, but really you're not going to know until you take off and you see it. So I took off and I'm heading towards Kobuk. And Kobuk's pretty far north. It's just north of the Arctic Circle. And there's this dark, dark rainstorm. There's no way I'm going to fly into that thing. You just don't want to fly into storms. And this one's a legit storm. There was lightning in there and all of that. And especially with lightning, you want to have a wide girth. So I had to deviate quite a bit to get around that storm, but so I was deviating to the west. And by the way, these storms in Alaska, they're beautiful. Like it'll be this really dark area of a thick storm, and then just to the west of it, there's some openings in the clouds, and these beams of light come through. And these beams of light illuminate this wet tundra below that's lush green. So you get these blue lakes, because there's like 3 million lakes in Alaska. Blue lakes, lush, glowing green, being illuminated next to a very dark storm. The photos I have on my camera now are just like National Geographic cover beautiful. Stunning, stunning stuff. So I don't mind the storms too much. I remember on this particular flight, I had it worked out for the weight and balance for me to take full fuel. So I had plenty of fuel to deviate. So I don't know how many miles I had to add to get around this storm, but I had to deviate around pretty far, and Kobuk was not in the storm, but I had to get around. And there was another storm further to west, and so I was kind of flying in between two storms. And that can be problematic if they're moving towards each other, but they were moving with each other. And so that gap remained when I got into Kobuk, and then when I left again, got out. All this to say is one of the interesting parts about flying in this area is that the resources we have for good weather is very limited. It's just like you have to like set your clock back, sort of back to the future stuff, because back in the day they did not have great weather reporting like we have now, but this area is still back in the Stone Ages of no information. So that makes for some of the decision making difficult because you have to make decisions based on incomplete information. So that's always a challenge. There was another issue that came up where these storms produce fires because storms mean lightning. Lightning strikes and starts fires across the tundra. This happens every year. Fires are pretty typical. But sometimes the fires get especially big. And one of them did. It was a fire near Fairbanks. And Fairbanks was completely socked in smoke. Like you could not even fly IFR into Fairbanks. They were turning away planes. The smoke got so thick, you could not fly in it. Even if you did, which I will get to, the smoke irritates your eyes so much, even inside the cockpit, it's hard to see. So while Fairbanks was completely socked in, Nenana, which is a town sort of near Fairbanks. It's about an hour drive south. But the smoke was blowing in the direction towards Fairbanks. And so Nenana was also covered in smoke, but not quite as thick. And I remember at camp there was an injury. It being a camp, injuries happen sometimes. And we were debating whether our medical person who was at the camp was examining this person who was injured, and we were having discussions whether we needed to fly this person out to the hospital. And while that person was being examined, we were looking at weather reports in Fairbanks, and we realized Fairbanks was turning away airplanes because the smoke was so thick. And so me and another pilot were like, well, if we got to do this, if we got to fly this person to the hospital, we're going to go together, because two IFR or instrument rated pilots are way better than one. It lightens the workload. It just makes it so much easier. And we're going to have to call Fairbanks Tower ahead of time to say, hey, I know you're smoked in, but we got to get in. We have an injury. So we were kind of making those plans. But in the end, the medical person made a decision that the person did not need to be flown out. And we just breathed a sigh of relief, because flying into thick smoke like that is very undesirable, even if you're on an IFR flight plan. It irritates the eyes. You really can't see anything. I know that's the point of IFR, but it was, you can't see all the way down to the runway. So we were looking into flying into Galena. There is a medical clinic there, but it seemed like that would have been insufficient based on the injury we were fearing. But in the end, the injury was not as bad as we had feared, but we were taking all the precautions. So that was a huge sigh of relief. However, I think it was the next day or so, we had to fly people out to Nenana, which was still technically VFR, legally speaking, but it was just difficult to see. And so we had to fly people to Nenana. And I remember flying into Nenana through this smoke. Smoke is just so miserable from these forest fires because it, like I said, it irritates the eyes. And I remember on one of the approaches, we decided, even though it was still VFR conditions, we decided to just load the approach. I loaded the approach in my Garmin 430, the RNAV for 4 left, into my Garmin 430. I loaded it and I just flew that, just as like a backup precaution, even though it was still VFR. The smoke being thick and irritates the eyes, I wanted to take all the safety precautions I could. So I had it loaded and I'm flying the approach, and my eyes got so irritated they started tearing up, and it looked like tears coming down my face, and my eyes were trying to get relief from the smoke, but I had to force my eyes to stay open so that I could see. I rely on my eyes very much. Even if it was IFR, I would still need my eyes. So, but I remember that being really not scary, just irritating or difficult to fly through smoke with very irritated eyes. But in the end, we were safe and fine. And so that was one of those, not an incident, but just a challenge that we faced. There was another time when we were getting geared up. We had just finished discipleship camp. There's high school camp, then discipleship camp, then there's junior high camp, then elementary camp. So it's 4 camps. And we were preparing for a junior high camp. Discipleship camp had ended, and this weather, and we had flown in the staff for junior high camp. They were in, and then this weather system very suddenly moved in. It moved in out of Siberia, this low pressure system with troughs all over the place. And it was still technically VFR, but the winds were so intense. And a trough is this line of low pressure that causes all kinds of weather problems. It's very unpredictable. For example, suddenly it would just start raining furiously, and then the rain would stop suddenly, and the rains would pick up and it'd blow everything like crazy, and the winds would suddenly stop. It was just this unpredictable weather. So myself and the other pilots would sit and we would look at weather reports and prog charts, and we were debating like, should we even attempt this? We got camp coming. And of course, this is like the classic pilot dilemma. They call it get there-itis, or, you feel the pressure of, you have about 100 people depending on you to make this camp happen. What do you do as a pilot? But as pilots, we learn and sit through training sessions on this kind of stuff and safety seminars. And this is what we talk about over and over and over again, that you have to remove those social pressures from your decision making, because no amount of pressure should pressure you to do something that'll get someone killed. Safety's the ultimate. It runs the day. Like, even legally speaking, as PIC, as pilot in command, no one has authority over me to tell me to do a flight. So we would sit down and we removed the social pressure from ourselves, and we said, is this safe? And we decided that it was not. And so maybe tomorrow. And so we'd wait the next day, and we decided it was not safe. We waited the next day. Still the same. This weather system just would not go away. It was lingering. And in the end, we had to cancel junior high camp. And even during one of those days, it was Derry from Mata decided to do like a test flight. And so the weather had lifted a little bit. And he's like, let me just take my plane out there and see what it's doing. So just he himself took off, and he did something that's pretty cool called a wind circle. That's what he called it. But you go up, he went up to about 1,500 feet MSL, and he flew in a circle. And when you fly in a circle like that, you can see what the winds are doing. So if you're flying, north, and you can look at your ground speed, and you're coming around the circle, and then you're flying south, and you can see the differences in your ground speed. It gives you a strong indication of what the winds are doing. And he concluded that the winds were blowing at around 50 knots, which is way too strong for just normal flying. And so Derry came back in and he landed, and those winds were just swirling and squirreling. It was really bad. In fact, he did one go around, and on the second attempt, he did land, but he came in high, which is actually a good thing to do, because the runway is 2,000 feet long, and for a 206, that's plenty long. And so coming in high is smart, because you never know if you're going to get a crazy downdraft, because that could happen with turbulent winds like that. So he ended up landing far, but he did a great job. And he came out of the plane and he goes, yeah, we're not flying anybody. And so that was part of, that was one of those tough ones, because it led to canceling junior high camp. And so what they did was they decided to combine elementary camp and junior high together, so that we can get the most kids to come to camp as possible. So we took fewer elementary camps, and everyone who had signed up for junior high were able to come the following week when the weather finally cleared. And that's how we did that. So another interesting thing that happened was there was another medical incident, and just some things happened, like medically speaking, and a young man needed to be flown out. And so when they decided that Derry would do it, because Derry had a student with him who was an EMT. So it was a really good choice to have this young man flown out, because he was going to have an EMT with him in the plane, which was great. So that worked out. So Derry took off early one morning for this medical thing. It wasn't life and death or anything, but this camper needed to go. So we were flying this camper out, and at camp we have the Starlink, which is Elon Musk's get internet anywhere system, and it's amazing. Like, you could stream movies. It's like very fast internet, and this year's the first year they've had Starlink since I've worked there, and it's like normal internet at home, but we're in the super remote place. It's incredible. So yeah, there's my plug for Starlink. You're welcome, Elon. But I'm connected to the Starlink with my phone, and so I get a phone call from Derry, who is on his way to Fairbanks. to bring this kid to his, it was his caretaker that lives there. So he had a comm failure, but he just picked up like a bar of signal somewhere along the way, and he was able to get a phone call through to me at camp. And all I heard was a lot of gargle, and because the signal was so bad on his end, and all I heard was squawking 7600. That's about all I could hear. Now, if you're training for private pilot or whatever it is, squawking 7600 means comm failure. If your comms fail, it's another way of you telling ATC or the control tower that your radio doesn't work, and it's through your transponder. And so that's all I heard. And so based on just hearing squawking 7600, I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew what I needed, because I knew he was on his way to Fairbanks, and Fairbanks is Class D airspace, so you need clearance to land there from the control tower. How do you do that without a radio? So that's why Derry called me, and I was able to call through the Starlink. I was able to call the control tower at Fairbanks, just say, hey, just so you know, there's a guy squawking 7600. His comms don't work. Here's his tail number. Here's his name. Here's his phone number. Here's everything you need to know. He'll be there in a half an hour or whatever it was. And they were awesome. Like, if you're ever hesitant about talking to control towers or whatever, like, those people want you to succeed. They want you to do well. In all of my experience with control towers, if you just tell them, like, I don't understand what you're saying, or I'm new here, or whatever, unless they're like overwhelmed or busy, they're going to be so helpful to you. And there's no exception here. They were very, very helpful. They said, yep, we understand it. He's clear to land runway 2. Just tell him to keep squawking that, and he's clear to land. So I was able to text Derry, who was still on his way, with the control tower phone number, and I told him he's clear to land on runway 2. And as he approached Fairbanks, he got signal, because it's Fairbanks and there's normal cell towers there. And he called the control tower, and he was just on the phone with them when he came in and landed. It just worked out beautifully. So, big thumbs up for technology, for Starlink, and for control tower people just being super helpful. It was great. So I thought that was kind of a neat story. And also the importance of just knowing basic things, like when you have a comm failure, what do you squawk? Knowing things like that can get you out of a bind. So I thought that was a cool story. There was an interesting aspect, which was with all the rain that we had, all these storms, a storm would rip through camp, and the heavy rains would erode like these gullies in the runway. And it looked like mini Grand Canyons. Now, these were a problem because with our Cherokee 6s, it's a nose wheel plane, and the 206s were too. But if the nose wheel got into that gully, it could cause that nose wheel to buckle. And so, not just that, but even if you rolled over these gullies, it would slow you down. And it's it's a shorter runway, especially for the Cherokees. The Cherokees they're kind of runway hogs. They need more runway than the 206s. So I was concerned about the gullies, and also the rain would soften up the runway. So it was like really soft. And so the wheels of the plane would have to plow through that soft mud, which would really slow it down also. So you get a massive decrease in takeoff performance. And of course, on landing, if you run over one of those eroded gullies, you could lose a nose wheel. So that'd be bad. So I was up there. I'd gather volunteers at the camp. We'd go up to the runway with wheelbarrows, shovels, and we even had like a little tractor with a sort of a scoop on it. And we used all those tools to fill in those gullies. And we had to do it constantly. Like, it would rain, gullies form, and we were back up there. It was just we were up there quite a bit. And the miserable thing about it was we'd get these huge downpours, and then it stopped raining. And for some reason, mosquitoes are like, this is our time. And the mosquitoes up on the runway are the worst. Unbelievable mosquitoes. And like, I grew up in the Midwest. I live in the Matsu Valley now. Like, the mosquitoes are just baby little mosquitoes out there for some reason on that runway. They are like the monster mosquitoes. They're like dragons landing on you and sucking your blood. They're just the most miserable things. And so I opt for just covering my whole body. I wear long pants, shoes that cover my feet completely. I wear gloves, and I have a shirt called a bug shirt. It's a material that mosquitoes can't penetrate. They can't bite through it. And I put up my hood, and I wear a head net. And I'm just inaccessible to the mosquitoes. Other guys, like some of these teenagers that were helping would shorts, t-shirt, lots of exposed skin, and they were taking 100% DEET, and they were just dousing themselves. And I'm like, I hate DEET. It smells terrible. It's so bad for your skin, and I just don't want to. I don't use it. So some of these young guys were up there constantly slapping their legs from mosquitoes, and they got eaten alive, even with 100% DEET, because these are monster mosquitoes. But they did it, and they were tougher than me. So good on them. Another time, it was Jeff and Derry, the two other pilots, were flying back from Nenana with some volunteers to camp. And I was at camp. I had finished my flying for that day, and they had one more flight. And suddenly a storm just swept through camp. It was very quick and very sudden. And so I was able to text Jeff on his inReach, which is like a GPS communicator. There you can send text messages through the satellite system. And so I sent him a text and said, a sudden storm just popped up, and here at camp, I recommend you divert somewhere. And so he wrote back, and he said he's diverting to Tanana. And Tanana is one of the villages. It's like 50 or 60 miles from camp. And when he diverted to Tanana, he and Derry both did together because they were flying together. And Tanana was still beautiful, just lovely, calm, clear weather. But just 50 or 60 miles away at camp, we were in this massive, crazy, windy, rainy storm. And so they just hung out in Tanana for a while. And then when it cleared, I was able to call him because he was able to get cell signal in Tanana. The villages have cell signal if you're with a cell service called GCI. And so we have that. So I called him, and we just kind of talked about the conditions, and the storm did calm down, and then they were able to fly in. But another kind of thumbs up the importance of like good communication, using the resources you have, because out there where we are, there's no radar. They had no way of knowing that there was a storm at camp because there's no radar service. So, and even when he did take off from Nenana to get to camp, the weather was fine. It just changed so quickly. And so the technology and the using the resources at hand just kind of saved the day. So that it made it just from like a really stressful thing to like a really non-stressful thing. Just landing somewhere, waiting a while, and then it cleared and they came in. So I thought that was a great testimony to the principle that we learned in safety seminars. You know, if the weather's bad now, just wait 2 hours. And this is one of those examples. I really enjoyed a few flights. One that was memorable was to the village of Koyuk. Now, Koyuk is a village we don't normally get campers from, but we had some this year, and I had never been there before. So that being a new village, I was trying to research it. What is the runway condition? How long is it? Is there a slope? How far is this flight? How much fuel reserve? All that stuff I was figuring out. But one thing that was most worrisome was the Nulato Hill Range, which is a range of hills or mountains, you might call them. I think the higher peaks are around 4,500 feet or so. And it's hard to tell what's going on over those hills. I've flown over those hills many times, but going to Koyuk, I would have to fly over a section I wasn't familiar with. And so I could tell around our camp, there's sort of those popcorn clouds. And then over at Koyuk, I can see it was kind of like half overcast, half blue clouds. And so I did not want to fly under the clouds because you don't want to be like dodging terrain with low clouds. That's very undesirable. But I was like, I could probably get over on top of these clouds. but getting over on top means climbing, and climbing slows me down. Like it can be beneficial. It depends on winds and various conditions. So anyway, the point is I took off and I'm heading towards Koyuk, and I flew under the clouds over the Nulato Hills. And I knew that if I could see the hills far enough before I got to them, if I could get through them before I got to them, if their clouds were broken enough that if I had to get up above the clouds, I could have. So I opted to go under the clouds on the way there. And the clouds were low, but I was still comfortably above the terrain. So that worked out pretty good. But then on the way back home, I opted for, with my passengers, and just to make it a more comfortable and smoother flight, to try to go over the clouds. And going over the clouds, the benefit is the air is usually very, very smooth. And it's usually a nice, smooth, comfortable ride for passengers. So with my passengers, I decided to go up and over. So I found a huge hole in the clouds. I did have to dodge around a little bit between clouds to get up on top of them. But once I was up there, it was so smooth. And now this is one of those flights where I had to make a decision, because conditions are constantly changing. And it had been several hours since I left camp, because it's a long flight. And being up in the air, I had no way to check weather or anything like that. So I got up above the clouds, and it's just smooth and easy and great. It's beautiful blanket of clouds under me, just lovely. And I love looking at breaks in the clouds, because you look down, the beams of light are like illuminating the land below, and it's just beautiful. I love that. But I'm looking ahead, and I'm not seeing cloud breaks towards camp. It looks like more solid over there. So I used my GPS communicator to write someone at camp, our flight coordinator, and I asked him, "Do you see blue sky where you are?" So he looks out the window and he writes me back and he says, "I do not see blue sky." So now I'm above the clouds, and at my destination, there are no holes to get back down. There were holes when I left, and now it's closed up. So this is one of those, well, what do I do now? I have my passengers, and I have to get to camp. So this is one of those decisions. And so from where I was heading towards camp, I could look to the north and I could see land, like I could see the ground further north, but that was a deviation. It would have extended the length of the flight. Or I could have kept on my path. I don't see any holes between here and camp, but it doesn't mean there aren't any. I just don't have a good angle. I'm not that high above the clouds. And so I can risk just there being a hole, or I can deviate to where I can see a hole, but it would make the flight longer. So that's when you have to check my fuel. How much fuel do I have? Can I do this deviation? And so I do a quick route change with my ForeFlight, and it gives me fuel predictions and how much more I would burn. And it looked good, like I would be able to do it. So I opted to deviate towards where I could see a hole, and it did extend my flight to be longer, but it was so much more comfortable. Like I got to my hole, even though I had to deviate to the north, went down comfortably, got under it, and then we flew to camp. And now as I got a lot closer to camp, I could see to the south of me that there were holes I could have gone down, but I didn't know that. And so I felt like that was the right call. And the only downside was my flight was like 15, 20 minutes longer, and it wasn't even a big deal. So those are some of the sorts of flight decisions that we have to make while we're out there. Now, one of the last things I want to share, and I want to talk about camp a little bit, is just the flight home. Taking off from camp at the end of the summer, flying home, it was this beautiful blue sky day. Now, beautiful blue sky day means bumpy rides. I've had just an infinite number of bumpy rides on days like that. Unless you climb really high where it's smoother air, if it's sunny out, the sun warms up the ground and it sends plumes of warm air up, and, hot air rises. So just these plumes of air come in and it causes turbulence. And it's just very unpleasant to be flying all day in that. And so on this last flight home, I was going to have my family, my wife and kids, and another young man that was with us. And we had to fly past the Denali Mountains. Now, To get from camp back to the Matsu Valley where I live, there's kind of 3 routes you can take. One is like Windy Pass, which is the eastern route. Windy Pass is what we usually do, even though it's actually the longest option, but we do it because there's a lot of towns and runways along the way. And so if you ever have any issues, you have lots of options. So we usually opt for that one, even though it's longer, but it's safer. The other option is Rainy Pass, which is a shorter flight, but it's more remote. There's less options. It's way away from the road system. There's a few places you could put down if you had trouble, but not very many. Most of the time, you're kind of just flying over nothing wilderness. So especially with and I've gone that way plenty of times, but especially with my family on board, I opt for the safer option, even though it might be longer. But on this particular day, I chose the third option, which because it was blue skies, no overcast or anything, I wanted to fly high. And flying high is great on days like that because when you get up there, you get away from the thermals and it's just nice and smooth. And also, we would go directly over the Denali mountain range. Now, Denali is over 20,000 feet high. So obviously, we're not going to fly over Denali itself. But at 9,500, I can fly over a majority of the mountain range. So you just pick a route that's safely above the mountains, and but it's sort of close to Denali. And it's great because as you're passing the Denali mountain range, you get this breathtaking view of the Denali mountain. So we were at 9,500, looking to the west of us, the great one, they say, Mount Denali, the tall one, I think it means. An unbelievably beautiful sight. And so we were snapping tons of pictures and stuff, and just such a beautiful reward after a month of living in the bush out there. Okay, so just to wrap up, I'm getting up to 45 minutes here, and don't want it to be too long. But a few really neat things at camp was at Kokrine Hills Bible Camp. They have a very good leadership structure. Because of I've been invited to board meetings, and I can see that they have high levels of accountability for the leadership to keep the highest level of integrity and good character and good use of resources. There's no waste. There's no one-man show. There's a high level of accountability and a sense of a shared mission and goal. Everyone's on the same page. And so because the leadership is good, it's like a safe ministry for us to want to invest our time in. And they also highly value the clear teaching of Scripture. They have a high value of Scripture and a high value for the clear presentation of the gospel is done really well at this camp. And so this camp for many young kids is like a little haven throughout their week. Some of them have very difficult lives and they come to camp and it's just like a really sweet week for them. When I fly kids home, many of them are crying, many because they are, they're just sad to leave camp, and others because they just don't want to go home, which is very, very sad when I take them home to their village. But point being, I'm very happy to extend my resources and time to serve this camp, and it's really a great gospel presence in Alaska. And of course, one of the challenges for these campers is that they go home and they're believers, but they don't have a church. There's no church body in their village. And so this is kind of the great challenge, right? Camp's great, but what about the rest of the year? And so that's one of the things that myself and people I work with talk about all the time is what do we do? And so that's kind of the constant conversation we are having. Okay, well, I'm going to cut it off there. There's so much more I wanted to say. This is actually my second recording. The first one I went way too long. I wanted to cut it shorter. But thank you for just getting a glimpse of what flying for camp is like. I would love to talk more about the camp itself. I focused on aviation stuff today because that was my primary role, but I can't emphasize enough how sweet it was. All of the conversations, the opening up, how a place like that and experiencing the remote Alaska like that opens up the heart. Not just with campers, but with the volunteer staff that came. I was especially drawn to the young volunteer staff because they come from worlds that I'm familiar with. If I could use stereotypical terminologies like American Baptist church world is where I come from, and many of these volunteer staff come from. And to hear them talk about the way they're developing and their fears and their doubts and their struggles, I just relate to them so much. And so I was drawn to them. And there's a really opening of the heart with an experience like that for the volunteers, but also for the campers. They're also out of their element. Even though they're still in Alaska, camp is different than home. It's an enriching environment. They're getting constant Bible teaching, and they're with counselors that love them very much. And of course, that can be quite a different experience than back home in their village. So what a sweet, sweet ministry, and I'm very happy to invest in that one. And of course, it produces some of the flying stories that I told. And so that's like the legacy of that place, and we hope to continue it. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening in. Upcoming next is some more interviews with some people. I will most likely be going back to Keiko really, really soon. And sort of a handful of like history things that I want to do. Some more episodes on history because I just love history stuff. So that's it for today. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next time.